Welcome to the Impact Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, Sabine Purps Saavedra, conservation documentary filmmaker and NGO director. This is a special episode. It's the podcast's 1 year anniversary and first episode of season 2. Thank you so much for all the support of your listeners over the past year and all the amazing guests I had the opportunity and privilege to talking to. I'm happy to start season 2 with Alexa Putillo. Alexa is a marine biologist, science communicator, and PhD student at the Biological and Oceanographic Department at the Florida State University. She studies the foraging ecology and habitat use of sea turtles along Florida's Gulf Coast. Her research integrates novel methods including stable isotope analysis, habitat assessments, and biologging devices to explore how different sea turtle species interact with their environments and shape the ecosystems they inhabit. A key focus of her work is understanding the ecological roles of sea turtles, such as how their foraging behavior influences habitats, structures, and ecosystems function in coastal areas. Today, we'll dive into her journey on what sea turtles can teach us about ocean health and why storytelling matters in science and conservation. Before we do so, if you like the Impact Storytelling podcast and want to support it, you can now do so via Patreon. This also gives you the opportunity to see ahead of time who will be the next guest, and you can submit your questions. Thank you so much for listening. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Alexa. I'm excited to explore the world of sea turtles with you. How did your fascination with sea turtles start? What inspired you to study them?
So it was during college, and so I was already studying marine science, and I was on a travel course to Costa Rica, and it was for a tropical biology and conservation course. And so we actually watched an olive ridley sea turtle lay her eggs at night one evening. And this whole process was just so surreal and inspiring for me. You watch this huge, ancient looking reptile who is made for the water, right? They have flippers for efficient swimming. Their shell is very streamlined. And so seeing her on land going through this whole process of crawling on the beach, digging her nest, depositing her eggs, covering it up, and then returning to the water, you see just how like strong and resilient they are. So this definitely inspired me and piqued some curiosity because up until that point, I had never really felt much of a connection to sea turtles. I hadn't really taken a vertebrate zoology course or anything, so I just didn't know a lot about them. And so this definitely piqued my curiosity. And a short while after, I started volunteering for a local sea turtle rehabilitation center. And then I learned about all of the different threats that they face, which are a lot. And so this kind of catalyzed a desire in me of just like, okay, how can I help? How can I use research and ask questions that will ultimately benefit this group of animals and lead to their conservation?
That's a really nice memory you have. I also still remember my first encounter with a sea turtle. I was diving, and all of a sudden I felt something touching me on my shoulder, and I was like, "What's that?" And I turn around, and I see a green sea turtle swimming by, and it had touched me when I was swimming by, and yeah, that was also a really memorable moment. And then I've seen some more behind that one, so that was really
I
nice.
know your first encounter is usually a special one.
It was really interesting. I try to never touch marine life, but when it comes to you, that's kind of fun. But I think then sometimes people have to remind it. If it touches you, it's okay. But if you can move away from that, then that's better. But also, you don't touch it. Sea turtles have roamed Earth's ocean for over 100 million years. What are some of the most fascinating things about their biology or behavior that most people might not know?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of just super interesting things. I'm gonna start with a couple basics just to, kind of make sure we're oriented and stuff. So sea turtles are air-breathing reptiles. So they spend the majority of their lives in the ocean, but they do come to the surface to breathe. There are 7 species of sea turtles globally, and they are the leatherback, the green sea turtle, the loggerhead sea turtle, flatback, hawksbill, and then the olive ridley and Kemp's ridley sea turtle. And each or a bunch of the different sea turtles, they kind of got their name for some of their species specific features, which I think is super interesting. So, for example, the green turtle, like you brought up, they got their name not because of any really external feature, but they are primarily herbivores feeding on marine plants, things like seagrass and algae. And over time, it actually turns their fat green. And so that's how they got their name. Another example is the loggerhead sea turtle. They have a very large head. It is large and thick like a log. And so they have this big head and this thick neck because it supports really powerful jaw muscles. So they eat really hard shelled prey, things like crustaceans and mollusks. Something else that's not always realized about sea turtles that I just want to mention is that as adults, they are quite large. And this sometimes surprises people. If you go on the internet and you look up sea turtle, oftentimes it'll be a photo of a green sea turtle and usually a smaller life stage, so like a juvenile or even a subadult. But as adults, they are quite large. So, especially the leatherback is the largest species in the world. As adults, they can reach up to 2,000 pounds, which is like 900 kilograms. So it's very, very large. Yeah. But you can compare that to the smallest species of sea turtle, which is the Kemp's ridley. And so as adults, they're typically like 100 pounds, which is, maybe 45 kilograms. Um, and then speaking of adults, something else that's pretty interesting is how you tell if a sea turtle is male or female. And so visually, you can't tell this until they're adults. So on a hatchling or juvenile sea turtle, researchers would have to do like a laparoscopy or a hormone test. But to be able to tell if they're male and female, just by looking with them, you have to wait till they're adults. And you tell this by the length of their tail. And so males have a much larger tail and it extends a bit outside of their shell because that's where their reproductive organs are. Whereas female sea turtles don't really have a long tail. Kind of similarly, males tend to have large claws on their front flipper, and this aids them during mating, whereas females have kind of short claws. And then one last thing that is pretty unique and unique to, some reptiles is that sea turtles have temperature dependent sex determination. And so the sex of turtles is determined while the eggs are incubating in the nest, and it's by the temperature of the sand. And so we say hot chicks, cool dudes, which is, a little phrase that helps us remember that if the temperature of the nest is hot, it's going to produce more females, where if there are cooler temperatures, it'll produce more males.
So, is that a problem with climate change? Are there more females now, or did climate change not impact that so much?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's short answer is yes. With climate change and global warming and warming of nesting beaches, there is definitely kind of research going on into is there feminization of different sea turtle populations due to the temperatures at nesting beaches being higher. So that's kind of an area of current research, but it's definitely a big question that we have and that we've had for the last couple years with global warming.
As we are already talking about hatchlings, can you walk us through the life of a sea turtle from when they hatch on the beach to becoming adults roaming the ocean?
Yeah, definitely. I might start with the mamas and then I'll get into the hatchlings. So yeah, female sea turtles, they will crawl onto the beach to nest. This process typically happens at night. And so she'll crawl up on the sand and find a spot that's suitable for her. She digs I've reenacted this in the sand so many times. So if I have body movements, that's why. So she digs a body pit with her front two flippers, and then she kind of positions herself in there. and then she digs an egg chamber with her rear flippers. This to me is so cool because she's using her rear flippers to like scoop out the sand, which I think is so impressive. And she digs an egg chamber, and the egg chamber looks like an upside down light bulb. And so once that is dug, she deposits her eggs. And the number and size of the eggs varies a little bit by species, but we'll just think about loggerheads or kind of in general. They'll lay about 100 ping pong ball sized eggs into the nest. It's a lot, yeah. And the eggs are not hard like a chicken's egg, because they might crack if she drops them in the egg chamber. So they're a little softer, even like a little leathery. So once she's finished, and this process can take a little bit of time, she puts the stand back in the nest, kind of compacts it a little bit, camouflages the nest, returns to the ocean, and that is the extent to her parental care. She'll nest usually a couple times in a single season, and then maybe takes, a couple of years off from nesting. So now the little ones. So the eggs incubate for about 2 months, and then, around 2 months later, the hatchlings, and it varies a little bit, depending on species and temperature and things like that, but about 2 months. And the hatchlings will emerge. Again, this usually happens at night, and they crawl to the water and hopefully make it. If they survive, the gauntlet of predators that they're exposed to for those first couple days and weeks of their life, they enter a period of time that is called the lost years. And so this is kind of when they're a little oceanic. Where I'm at in the world, they're kind of associated with kind of algal mats, so sargassum algae, for the first couple years of their life. One thing that's really exciting is there was actually new research published a couple months ago, I believe, on the stage of their lives. And previously, it was thought that during this stage, they were just kind of drifting and very kind of more offshore in oceanic habitats. And we don't know as much about their life in this stage. And so, this new research actually found that there was active swimming behavior during this stage, and that they weren't only using those oceanic habitats, that there was some overlap between where when they were kind of offshore, but then also moving a little bit more into neritic habitats. So, the authors even suggested renaming this stage as like a dispersal stage. So, that was something cool. So, we're definitely still learning more about them at this stage. But they'll stay in their kind of dispersal stage or the lost years for like 5 to 10 years. And then they recruit to coastal areas where they settle into their foraging grounds. And so it takes sea turtles a couple decades to reach maturity. But once they are ready, they return to breed, often migrating, hundreds to thousands of kilometers back to their nesting beach.
That's amazing. And how long are the eggs inside of the mother before she puts them into the hole in the sand?
That's a really good question. So after mating, female sea turtles usually take a couple of weeks before nesting. Again, it depends a little bit on the species, but could be anywhere from like 2 weeks to maybe 6 weeks. And then during this time, the eggs are developing inside her. And then once she's ready, she does come up. One thing that's really interesting is that one female can mate with several males before the nesting season. And so this stored sperm can fertilize multiple clutches inside of her. And so as a result, these different clutches may contain offspring from different fathers, which is called multiple paternity.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I know there's images
So
out
they're
there.
half siblings.
Yes. I've definitely seen, and you might have too, some of the images where you have a female and there's like three males around her trying to trying to mate. So
What I've realized is over the last years, sea turtles or the baby turtles have been quite popular, and a lot of conservation projects came about also from hotels and a lot of tourism things, where I'm not so sure if it's always done right, or they're taking the freshly hatched turtles and bringing them right to the ocean, not letting them walk. or just posing with them for a photo from your standpoint. What do you think about that? And is there maybe a better way to do it, or what's a good way to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of that stems from just kind of really understanding how important this process is for them. Um, their development inside of the nest, like, so some of the goals here in Florida, a lot of the conservation on nesting beaches, the goal is to protect those eggs while they're in the nest. After that, the goal is for everything to happen kind of naturally. But I know in other parts of the world, yeah, there are um, different kind of tourist operations where um, folks might interact more with those animals. Um, my experience and my knowledge is never to touch an animal unless you need to do so, or unless you're really trained to do so. And so I think making sure that these operations are run by trained staff and really biologists, also that there are proper permits if they are required. So here in Florida, we operate under very specific permits if folks are doing nesting or hatchling or conservation work. Um, Another thing that I know we've talked about that I hope a lot of these agencies and companies talk about, is light pollution, and so brings a lot of folks to kind of nesting areas. I think it's really important. I know here in Florida, at least, there's a lot of kind of hotels and like coastal management areas, but they give a lot of guidance for how to be the best kind of turtle safe you can when you're visiting these areas. And so when hatchlings are emerging out of their nest and making their way to the ocean, um, their instinct is to follow the brightest horizon. And usually that is the ocean, especially on an undeveloped beach, where the other side should have pretty extensive dune habitats with dune vegetation. Um, and so they're really sensitive to kind of that like brightest horizon. Now, on a more developed beach, maybe with a lot of development or tourism, if that brightest horizon or that brightest light source is coming from an artificial light source from things like flashlights or street lights or houses, it can disrupt that natural ability and it can cause those hatchling turtles to go the opposite direction or crawl the wrong way. And so when this happens, we call that a disorientation. And it can be very problematic because it can make them more susceptible to predators. They can dehydrate, they can starve. And so I think, there's a lot of great operators in Florida that are actually under specific permits to do things like turtle walks, but I'm always very hesitant for operations that actually allow you to interact with the animal unless it's absolutely necessary to do so.
Last year, I was studying for a natural history film festival, and I've seen a film that captured the problem you just mentioned, where animals are going towards the light and they actually went over streets and gotten run over by cars, or in the morning, they dehydrated and yeah, then the hotels and the restaurants started working together with conservation groups. And they all had like these boxes where they would put the baby turtles inside and then bring them to the rescue center, or the rescue center would pick them up. So I think there are some good programs because these turtles, they obviously need to be touched and need to be brought back to the beach. And they were working with scientists, and I think that's great. But yeah, as I said, I also have heard of others which are just basically using it for promotion. So I think as everyone has seen a picture of a baby turtle before, they are quite small, and so is their shell. And then they grow, and they grow really, really big sometimes. How does their shell grow with them, and why is the shell important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sea turtle shells basically grow as the turtle grows. The shell is made of bone and it's covered by keratin. So these are the things, keratin like in our fingernails and things like that. Um, Unlike other reptiles, it doesn't shed, it doesn't molt. Instead, it kind of grows continuously. And so new layers of bone and keratin are added at the edges and underneath the scutes. So, scutes, if you've seen their shell, they kind of have those like keratinized plates. Those are called scutes. This kind of large scale plates on the shell. And so because the shell is kind of really part of a turtle's skeleton, it grows with them and it's not something they can, leave or kind of outgrow.
Wow. So you said it's like a bone material, so it can heal?
Yes. It's a great question. Depending on the specific injury kind of in question, um, I've worked at rehabilitation centers where there's been such a deep injury to their carapace or their shell, and air actually gets trapped inside. And so while the shell looks a little funky, but overall it has kind of healed, it can't dive because of that air trapped inside. Um, I've seen other turtles that have been unfortunately hit by a boat and they have kind of like a propeller scar going through their shell. But it was not deep enough to kind of, really puncture, and I've seen them, they're still scarring, but for the most part, they are, swimming and acting normally. We've also seen turtles that have had shark bites to them, and so they might be missing, like, kind of the back chunk of their carapace and maybe one of their limbs. We've seen that a little bit, and while again there is kind of that scarring, we have seen healed wounds.
Good at least some of that can heal.
Yeah, they have a lot of threats, but they are very resilient. Um, yeah.
Yeah, they are a long time on the planet already, and sea turtles are also known for their incredible migrations.
Mhm.
How far do they actually travel, and what are they looking for when they migrate?
Yeah, their migrations are incredible. Um, they can travel thousands of kilometers during their migrations, sometimes spanning ocean basins. This really depends on the species, the region, the life stage. Leatherbacks are the most highly migratory of all the sea turtle species. But then, depending on the other species, they also undergo pretty long migrations. And their migrations are typically driven by two main things reproduction and food. So adults are often migrating long distances to return to the beaches where they nest, and then also between nesting seasons, back to their foraging grounds. And then juveniles and subadults, they also migrate maybe between their foraging habitats. They might be shifting and searching for suitable foraging habitats as they grow. But yeah, they can span pretty long distances, but it definitely depends on the species, the life stage, and the region.
Where in the world can sea turtles be found? Do different species stick to certain regions, or are some more global in their range?
Yeah. So in general, sea turtles have a pretty wide distribution globally, but their range really depends on the species. As we're kind of learning and talking about, different species are fairly different in so many kind of aspects of their life. I really am like, it depends on the species. Um, but they're mainly found in tropical to temperate waters of the Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic Oceans. Some species might reside in more coastal habitats, which could include like bays and estuaries. Others are usually associated with structure and substrate or coral reef habitats. Kind of like I mentioned, leatherbacks are the most highly migratory. They also have the widest distribution of all sea turtles. They are also the deepest divers of all species. Olive ridleys and loggerheads also have a pretty wide distribution. Green turtles are usually found in the subtropics and tropics worldwide. This is pretty similar with hawksbills as well, but hawksbills tend to stay a little more around the tropics. They're usually associated with coral reefs and reef habitats. And this leaves the two species that are a little more geographically distinct. So there is the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, and they tend to stick to, it was formerly called the Gulf of Mexico. So they tend to stick to that area. And then also in the Western Atlantic, they stay pretty near shore and in neritic shelf waters and have pretty narrow migratory corridors. And then last is the flatback sea turtle, which is actually endemic to Australia. And so they typically stay in kind of the shallow coastal waters around Australia.
Nice. And we already talked about a couple of issues that turtles are facing, like climate and boat traffic and the lights. And I think we've all seen pictures of turtle eating plastic bags or that one photo where a turtle had a straw in its nostril. Um, but what other issues are they facing? What are they facing today from human activities and environmental change?
Yeah. So unfortunately, sea turtles face a lot of threats, as you mentioned, as exactly is fairly well known, which I feel. But one of the biggest ones that I definitely want to highlight because I don't think it's always talked about as the biggest or one of the biggest threats they face globally, and that's entanglement in fishing gear. So this could be sea turtles being caught as bycatch, which is incidental capture in fishing gear, but also includes entanglement in things like trawls and long lines and gill nets and other traps. Oftentimes, bycatch is just discarded, and then sea turtles need air to breathe, and so if they are entangled for a period of time, unfortunately, they could drown. It could also lead to like very serious injury. Um, and then kind of other threats, how we talked a little bit about the coastal development, increasing light pollution. Coastal development also can take up really critical nesting habitat. It can develop into dune habitats, which are really kind of important for their nesting process. And then how you mentioned plastic pollution and marine debris in general, they can accidentally ingest some of these items, but they can also become entangled in them as well. And then, how we talked about climate change and global warming and those kind of environmental threats as well. With temperature dependent sex determination, this is an issue. Also, increased storm activity and sea level rise can also impact their nesting beaches, just in terms of washover of nests or beach erosion as well.
Well, they're facing a lot of threats. And is there something an individual can do to help protect them?
Yeah, I think there's so many things that folks can do and that can have meaningful impacts. Um, Both kind of on more nesting beaches and if you're out boating, but also in everyone's everyday life. For nesting beaches, we like to say keep the beach clean, dark, and flat. These are, kind of the best actions you can take to help protect turtles during their nesting process. Keeping the beach clean, packing back in everything that you bring. Beach furniture, leaving that on the beach can be a huge issue for entanglement for nesting turtles. Same in keeping it flat. We all love to enjoy our beach days with holes and sandcastles, but those can actually be really big obstacles for tiny hatchling turtles or even adult females if she gets caught in one of those holes. So filling those back in and getting rid of your sandcastles at the end of the day, if it is nesting season, is super helpful. And then, of course, keeping the beach dark at night is also really important. And then, kind of how we talked about really respecting wildlife and their habitat, giving nesting sea turtles their space, never disturbing nests or hatchlings. This includes, if you are, lucky enough to get to be in the presence of one of these events, keeping your distance and not using your flashlight, not using flash photography, because this can start to disrupt some of those natural processes. Um, and then also just kind of reducing your plastic waste. Your waste is always going to be helpful. And then boating responsibly. If you are a boater and you frequent waters that sea turtles also use, This is a big issue for us here in Florida. Um, Especially as, a lot of folks boat in the same coastal areas that sea turtles use to forage or they use for mating. And so making sure, yeah, you're keeping an eye out. Honestly, polarized sunglasses, having those while you're boating is very helpful. I always like to recommend having a designated wildlife spotter. I always offer to do it because I want to look for wildlife anyway. So this could always be helpful. And then just knowing when nesting season might be in your area and when turtles might be more likely to be in some of the same areas that you're using. And then, of course, supporting conservation groups, having these conversations with other folks, just talking about it and voting for, you know, policies and practices that have the best interests of sea turtles and wildlife in general.
That's a great list of things that people can do to help protect them.
Mhm.
And what are some of the tools that researchers use to learn more about sea turtles and ways to protecting them?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different methods, some more traditional and that are pretty widely used, and some with some advanced technology, just being able to have access to those. So some of the most common ways are going to be tagging. There are two main types of ways we tag turtles. One is with flipper tags, and they're small tags that go on their flippers, and they have a unique code of letters and numbers that help us identify the individual. A pit tag is also used, and it's kind of like a microchip that you would give to your dog or an animal or something, and it gives that individual a permanent ID. And then some kind of the more advanced technology and tools that have come about, in recent decades. One is satellite telemetry and satellite tags. These have really allowed researchers to track long distance movements and migration routes across oceans. So, this is a super useful tool, especially for sea turtles that utilize many habitats and go on these migrations. Animal borne cameras and biologging devices have also become pretty popular in kind of recent years. This can give us a kind of turtle's eye view of what they're doing in a habitat and their kind of fine scale behaviors. And then biologging devices can give us information on what depths they might be using and more of their movement with things like acceleration. There are also biochemical tools, things like stable isotope analysis and fatty acid analysis. And this can help give us kind of a picture of what habitats they might be using and what they might be eating over time. And then blood sampling is another tool that gives us insight into their overall health and stress and even exposure to pollutants. So there's a lot of different ways, and kind of integrating multiple of these tools in research has been really useful to give us a bigger picture and a fuller picture of sea turtle ecology. And then, in addition to tools we use to actually study the animals, it's also been very helpful for us to study the habitats that they might be using, both on land and in the water. So, for example, on nesting beaches, researchers can put out temperature and water loggers near a nest or in a nest. And that helps us track what temperature the nest is, maybe in certain depths. And water loggers can help us identify, did this nest get washed over at any point with storm activity or high tides, and then kind of habitat assessments in foraging areas as well. So all of these tools kind of work together to give us a really good picture of sea turtle ecology.
You use something called stable isotope analysis. What is that? How does that work? And why is it such a powerful tool for this kind of research?
Yeah. So stable isotope analysis is definitely a very powerful tool because it looks at the nutrients assimilated in tissue over time. So this could be on a scale of weeks to months, depending on what type of tissue is being analyzed. So usually it could be a very small sample of their skin or a small sample of their shell. Um, and stable isotope analysis can give a very broad kind of determination of diet rather than some other methods to investigate diet, which might give us more snapshots of what they're eating very recently. And so stabilized soaps worked because Um, the isotope compositions of a consumer's tissue, in this case, sea turtles, reflects the diet and geographic location of where that animal was foraging and consuming resources. So, dietary studies using stable isotopes usually focus on two main elements, which are carbon and nitrogen isotopes, where the carbon isotope can usually tell us where an animal, in this case turtles, are feeding. If they're feeding more pelagic or offshore, or if they're feeding in more benthic or shallow areas. And then the nitrogen isotope reflects trophic level. And so this can tell us kind of how high up on a food chain are sea turtles eating. And so this method becomes even more powerful when we not only collect isotope data from the consumer, in this case, sea turtles, but also isotopes of all the potential prey items in a given area. And so this prey isotope data can then be integrated in statistical models that can actually estimate the contribution of the different prey items to the overall consumer's diet on this kind of like long term scale.
That sounds really interesting.
hmm
And do sea turtles actively choose what to eat, or do they just go for what's most available in the environment?
That is such a good question. And that's something that I'm kind of actively actually looking at. So short answer is kind of both. Availability of a prey item definitely matters, but sea turtles aren't always eating the most common or abundant food item. There's been evidence that some species, at least, select for certain types of food over others, even when those foods might be less available. So, some individuals like these might be acting as specialists, so focusing on specific prey types, whereas other individuals behave more as generalists, kind of taking advantage to whatever is accessible in the habitat. And so this is kind of why habitat assessments are so important, integrating those with dietary studies, because um, if we want to understand what turtles are eating and why, we need to know what's actually available in their environment. So, by combining kind of diet data and habitat data, we can get a clear view of foraging strategies, nutritional needs, and then really how to protect these areas that they rely on. It can also help us predict how any environmental changes or shifts in prey availability might impact their diet and behavior over time.
You're also comparing different sea turtle species like green turtles, loggerheads, and Camp Ridleys. How do their diets and habitats differ even when they're in the same area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So those are the three species that I'm currently studying that currently reside in the foraging area that I work in. And so they're called sympatric species, and that's when different species live in the same area. And this often happens with sea turtles. They often overlap in their foraging grounds, especially in really productive coastal areas. So they definitely eat different things and then also kind of use different microhabitats within a given area. So green turtles are mostly herbivores. So they feed primarily on seagrass and also algae. And then loggerheads and Kemp's-Ridley turtles are more omnivorous or carnivorous, and they're eating a lot of hard-shelled prey, things like crabs, mollusks, and other invertebrates. And so this kind of leads to them utilizing different habitats. So green turtles will usually be found more in like shallow seagrass meadows, whereas loggerheads and Kemp's-Ridleys might be using more hard bottom habitats or kind of like sandy patches. But these are still a lot of the questions that we have surrounding, their coexistence in a foraging area. So just like, are they partitioning their habitat in space and time? Is there competition for food or resting areas? And then are they interacting with each other in this habitat? And if so, how? So those are still kind of the questions that we're looking to address.
You mentioned niche partitioning. What does that mean, and how does it help different species of turtles coexist in the same ecosystem?
Yeah. So niche partitioning, it's an ecological concept, and it describes how similar species coexist by using their environment in different ways. And this ultimately reduces competition for resources. So for sea turtles, it's kind of reflected in their differences in diet or how they're using a habitat or what depth they're typically residing or foraging in.
Green sea turtles are sometimes called ecosystem engineers. Can you explain the role they play in shaping the seagrass?
Yes. So through grazing, green turtles can influence the structure and function of seagrass systems. Similar to grazers in, terrestrial systems, they can have positive functions in seagrass habitats. This includes removing older, maybe pathogen susceptible seagrass blades. They can transfer energy to higher trophic levels, and they can also increase the rate of productivity and nutrient cycling in seagrass systems through grazing.
In your study, you created a turtle free zone to see how seagrass responded. What did you observe, and was there something that surprised you?
Yeah. So we deployed something that we call an exclusion cage. And this method has been used a bit for looking at the effects of green turtle grazing, but then also other grazers as well. So it um, is really this area where we kind of cage off and it prohibits grazers, in this case, green turtles, from entering that area and foraging on the seagrass inside of that. And then this is usually compared to an adjacent plot that is open to grazing. And so after a period of time, we can go back and take measurements and look at what were the effects of in the grazed plot compared to the ungrazed plot. So our results actually surprised us. After 3 months of this method, we found very minimal differences between between grazed and ungrazed plots. We measured a couple different seagrass parameters, but only one parameter, and that was shoot density, was higher in grazed plots. And we actually saw no effect on blade length or width. And in most of these studies, usually one of the first parameters you see an effect on is blade length because they are clipping the seagrass to forage. And so blade length is going to decrease. And so from our results, it suggested that at our site, there were mainly juvenile green turtles, so smaller individuals. They were exerting a pretty low grazing pressure. And this is not always the case. Um, but this could be due to many different factors. It could be due to them having more of a mixed diet, especially at younger life stages. Um, or overall, the turtle densities in our study site were so low that they were well within the carrying capacity of that seagrass meadow. Our site also had a pretty diverse presence of sharks, which are predators for sea turtles. And so there's actually been shown that sharks can cause kind of like behavior mediated effects on turtle grazing. So turtles might be using and foraging in kind of smaller micro habitats that might offer more protection instead of kind of in the middle of these seagrass meadows where our study took place. And so our results definitely showed us that the effects of green turtle grazing are definitely context dependent and can vary based on so many factors, including turtle density, presence of predators, and other site conditions.
Earlier, you said green sea turtles mostly eat plants. Would they just have eaten algae, or would they go for something completely different if they weren't eating so much seagrass?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that study area, there were actually diet studies done, and they found that while green turtles were eating seagrass, it was the dominant forage item for them. They were also feeding on green algae, red algae, and sponges as well. So we think in sometimes in some of these earlier life stages, they have more of a mixed diet, but they really start to specialize on seagrass kind of as, they get bigger and older. So this definitely could have been one of the reasons why we got the results that we did.
And how does turtle grazing compare to other grazers in the ocean, like fish or manatees? Are turtles unique in what they do?
That's a great question. So green turtles are definitely part of a broader grazing community in marine systems. So green turtles tend, when they graze, they tend to clip the seagrass kind of at the base, a couple centimeters above the sediment or kind of level of the ground. And so this can be compared to like cutting your hair really short or a lawn mower in grass. So this compared to other mega herbivores like dugongs and manatees, they typically create kind of like feeding trails where they're consuming not just that above ground biomass, but also the shoots and the rhizomes of seagrass as well, which are those kind of underground root systems. Um, and then this compared to herbivorous fish, green turtles tend to create like grazed plots. So they'll repeatedly graze the same areas, creating kind of an area where there is grazed seagrass that could be adjacent to an area of ungrazed seagrass. Whereas, so they're a little selective in that way. Whereas fish might be a little more mobile in their grazing and a little less selective, and the fish grazing I've seen, they take more bites of the seagrass blades instead of like clipping at the base like green turtles do.
It's interesting how everyone eats different, although they're all eating the same thing.
Exactly.
How can understanding turtle diet and health help conservationists make better decisions, for example, about protecting certain habitats or food sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, So I think I've said the word foraging ecology a couple times, but understanding this and I'll better define it is really important. And so it's foraging ecology is kind of the process of how an animal finds food, chooses food, and uses food. It is central to conservation. And this includes not only the location and consumption of resources, but it also includes how an animal retrieves and stores it, and all of this is within the context of kind of a larger community, the ecosystem. So for animals, understanding their foraging ecology provides insights into how food resources support their growth, reproduction, and health. So a turtle's foraging strategy can influence key life history traits like their growth rate, age at maturity, and also immune function. And so, by studying things like diet and health together, conservationists can identify what habitats provide really critical food resources and how nutritional quality might affect turtle condition. So, for example, if sea turtles consistently select certain prey or are using these very specific habitats, it can tell us that those resources in those habitats are very valuable. And that can lead to prioritizing the protection of these kind of key foraging areas.
Very nice. So let's hope that there will be more protected areas with research like this.
Hmm.
Many conservation efforts focus on nesting beaches, but your research suggests that foraging grounds are just as important. Why are these feeding areas often overlooked?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, nesting beaches are a little more accessible, right? They're on land. And so they're easier to monitor, and they've been monitored for decades. Like some of the pioneers of sea turtle research, the early research was done on nesting beaches. So this has made it more feasible to track long-term trends in things like nesting numbers or reproductive success over time. In contrast, foraging areas, they're trickier to study. They can be offshore. They can be sometimes in maybe murkier areas. They can be harder to identify. And just logistically, they're much more difficult to study. You need the time and the resources to be able to access these foraging areas. And sometimes they could even be in kind of remote areas. But it's really important because sea turtles spend most of their lives in the water. And so they're spending a lot of time in these foraging areas. But it can also be difficult because turtles might use these habitats, these foraging areas year round as residents, or they could kind of be shifting between foraging sites. And so, kind of as a result for this, these foraging areas might have received less attention historically. Um, but they're really important for kind of all life stages. You think about juveniles and subadults, these areas provide the energy they need for growth and reproduction and overall survival. So protecting them is just as important for long-term conservation. But we're definitely still uncovering some of the what we know about how turtles are using foraging habitats. And so there's definitely so much more to learn to really effectively protect them.
It's a really interesting research field you're in.
Thank you.
And what's something you wish more people would understand about sea turtles and their role in the ecosystem?
Yeah. So I think we touched on just some of the important functional roles that sea turtles play in ecosystems. There's so many more we weren't able to get into. But beyond some of these ecological roles that they have, sea turtles also serve as bioindicators for marine systems. So they are long lived, they occupy a range of habitats, and they utilize both marine and terrestrial environments for different parts of their life. And so ultimately, the health and behavior of sea turtles reflect broader changes in ocean conditions. So when we study sea turtles, we're also learning more about the state of the ecosystems that we all depend on.
And finally, what are you most excited to explore next in your research? And how could it change how we think about sea turtles in years to come?
I am really excited to dive a little deeper into understanding the foraging ecology of loggerheads and Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. So, we probably know the most about green sea turtles, especially their herbivorous diet and how they interact with seagrass habitats. And so understanding the foraging ecology and ecological roles of some of the other sea turtle species has maybe not received as much attention as green sea turtles, but they could be shaping benthic communities in really important ways. And so I think filling this knowledge gap is not only exciting from a scientific perspective, but it's also critical for more species specific and ecosystem based conservation strategies. And so that's kind of something that I'm really excited to continue in.
That sounds really exciting. And I hope to have you on the podcast soon again with your new research. Thank you so much for sharing so much about sea turtles. And I'm sure the listeners also find it really interesting and enjoyed this conversation and were inspired by learning so much about sea turtles. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time and yeah, I hope folks enjoy listening.